Hello. This video is going to discuss US grand strategy and Asia. In particular, what we will look at is how the US has approached Asia since it gained independence from the United Kingdom. In the next module, you will look at Asian security and Chinese military strategy in particular in much more detail. But we will touch upon some of these subjects today as well. And the most important point I want to make, particularly in the early part of this video, is that contrary to some of the reporting you may have seen in the past 3 or 4 years, the reality is that the United States has always had a presence in Asia. Indeed, if you look at this picture of the large sailing vessel, the Empress of China, this vessel sailed to China only a few months after the United States gained independence. At that time, the US sent 2 vessels. One went to Europe to start trading relations with the United Kingdom, or Britain at the time, and with France, and the other went to China to gain a foothold, or an economic foothold there. So from the very beginning, Washington recognized it needed a presence across the Pacific. And that presence gained steadily over the following years. The picture to the bottom right of the horse shows the US gaining control over the Philippines. It is worth noting the Philippines is pretty much the only colony the US has had in its history. It took control in the late 19th century and only gave it back after World War II. And the other 2 pictures show the Great White Fleet and its arrival in Yokohama. And the Great White Fleet set sail in 1907. It was 16 battleships at the time, and it went on a global voyage to show that the US had become a global naval power. But possibly its most famous feat was its arrival in Japan, where it showed Japanese leaders that the US had become an Asian power that had to be contended with alongside the other white Asian powers, including Britain, France, and Russia. And what the Great White Fleet did was it opened up Japan for greater US economic involvement. And of course then you have the 2 examples of World War II and the Korean War, where in the early and middle parts of the 20th century, the US put together some of the largest naval and military forces the world has ever seen to project power across the Pacific for its own security interests. And then, more latterly, during the Cold War, it is worth putting the US global presence in context. So during the Cold War, Asia was a prominent battleground for proxy conflicts with the Soviet Union and other communist countries. The US approach to the region was based on the concept of the domino theory and credibility. In essence, the US feared that if one country fell to communism, the US would lose credibility and many countries would fall to communism. This partially informed their decision to fight in Korea, and almost fully informed their decision to fight in Vietnam for so long. Alongside this, they supported allied or non-communist regimes and often advocated regime change if they felt a local government was turning towards communism. So for example, they supported the dictatorships in Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So while Europe during the Cold War was the strategic center, where you had 2 forces facing against each other, but there was virtually no combat, in Asia you had an equally large US military force in many cases in active combat against Soviet proxies. So it is kind of wrong to say the US is only now engaging in Asia and leaving Europe. They've always been engaged in Asia. Now, to understand why the US is so interested in getting in Asia, all you have to do is look at a map. It is all about geostrategy. As Robert Ross argues, US geostrategy has always been about ensuring that there is not one dominant power on either side of the United States, be it in Europe or in Asia. Prior to World War II, they relied on balance of power politics. We have previously talked about how the United Kingdom relied on balance of power politics in Europe to ensure no one country dominated that continent. But the US also relied on balance of power politics in Asia, particularly the ability of the United Kingdom and Japan and Russia and other European powers, alongside factionalism in China and other countries, to ensure that there was some sort of balance of smaller states rather than one dominating state. But that was prior to World War II. Imperial Japan's rise, attack on Pearl Harbor, and then successful or almost successful occupation of large swathes of Asia persuaded the United States that it needed a much greater presence in the region, and that it could no longer rely on balance of power politics after the war ended, but rather needed to be directly involved. And that has been the policy from the Cold War right up until now. Very similar, some would argue, to what went on in Europe. But of course, this is an extremely difficult strategy to follow. Why is that? It's something that we call the tyranny of distance. And all it is about is that it makes it so difficult for the US to project power. And as this slide shows, sailing from San Diego all the way to the South China Sea can take anything between 13 and 21 days. Hawaii, one of the major naval bases, 10 to 16 days. And then obviously Guam, Okinawa, and Tokyo, the other major Asian naval bases, even 2 to 3 days or 3 to 5 days sailing time. So the US needs to overcome that problem of tyranny of distance. It makes the projection of military power more difficult. It makes reassuring allies more difficult. And if there's a rising strong power, it means the US has to work extremely hard to persuade regional powers that the strong rising power can be combated or counterbalanced by the United States. So this is a very difficult thing to pull off, as the United States is finding out right now. Geostrategy and geography informs these difficulties. So how do they get around it? The first one is, of course, alliances. Now, it is worth noting that the US alliance approach in Asia is extremely different to the approach it took in Europe. In Europe, it took NATO as a collective security organization with the US at the center. In Asia, the approach was different. It is called the hub and spoke system, with the US at the center, but instead of having a collective group of alliances, you had individual alliances. So the US is allied with Japan and the Republic of Korea, but Japan and the Republic of Korea are not allied to each other. The same goes with the Philippines and, to a lesser extent, Australia. Why did they take this approach? Well, there are various arguments. One was that the cultural and political and strategic differences between the various allies made a collective approach too complicated for the US to pull off. For example, historical enmity between Japan and the Republic of Korea made it very difficult, or even geographic distance between, say, Australia and those countries in Northeast Asia made an alliance almost worthless. Another argument is that the US feared entrapment in Asia to a much greater degree than they did in Europe, particularly in the early stages of the Cold War. And so they wanted much greater control over their regional allies. Don't forget, the United States occupied Japan following the war and ran it until Japan gained administrative independence. So the hub and spoke system gave the US more control over its allies so they would follow US policy positions, thereby reducing the risk of entrapment and increasing the Allies' reliance on the US through complicated military capacity building measures and things like that. So the alliances are one part of how the US has maintained a powerful presence in Asia. The second one, obviously, is forward deployment. Now, this map is a little bit old, but it kind of shows it broadly shows the number of troops that the US has deployed across the region. In Japan, you have large numbers of particularly Navy and Air Force and Marines based in a number of naval and Air Force bases in that country. In South Korea, it is predominantly an Army command, and then you have smaller numbers in the Philippines and in Thailand, and in Australia now you have upwards of 2,000 US Marines in addition to the forces shown there. So you have a large number of naval forces, Marines, and some Army and Air Force forward deployed into Asia. It is worth noting again that Pacific Command, or Indo-Pacific Command as it is known now, is primarily a naval command. Unlike Europe, which is primarily an army command, Asia has traditionally been a naval command, with the Army's only real presence in the region in South Korea. If you just look at this map, it emphasizes the importance of Japan in particular to the US presence there. Without Japan and the permanent US naval bases in Japan, the United States would find it increasingly difficult to maintain any kind of presence there. Similarly, as you'll learn in a few weeks' time, due to Chinese missile capabilities in particular, fighting a war against China if Japan's naval bases are no longer in play makes life very, very difficult as the US is forced further and further away. And this is just a modern picture of just the Pacific Fleet surface ships that are currently assigned to the region. This includes 2 to 3 carrier battle groups at any one time, one of which is permanently deployed or stationed in Japan. Now, moving away from that kind of broader overview of the US grand strategic approach to Asia, it is worth looking a little bit at how US-China relations has developed from the US perspective. So obviously after World War II and the Communist Party takeover of China, there was significant tension. 1950, the Korean War, Chinese forces or Chinese volunteers were in direct combat with US military up until 1953. A year later, there was a significant crisis on the Taiwan Strait as Chinese forces shelled Taiwanese islands and threatened an invasion. At that point, the US reportedly threatened to nuke Beijing or Chinese strategic targets if they did invade Taiwan. Latterly, in 1964, China became the world's the second communist power to have a nuclear weapon. So tensions were rising between Beijing and Washington from 1950 really up until 1964-65, and then something happened. In 1969, there was a conflict between Communist China and the Soviet Union along the border. And all of a sudden for China, the big threat was not in Washington, but their bigger threat was in Moscow. And this geostrategic reality brought about a kind of rapprochement between the United States and China. So in 1971, there was something called the ping-pong diplomacy, where there was increasingly higher level diplomatic activity between the US administration and the Communist Party in Beijing, particularly run by Henry Kissinger. What arose from that was UN recognition of the Communist Party as the primary government of China in 1971. And then, of course, as this picture shows here, in 1972, President Nixon visited China to start developing economic ties and seeing a pathway forward for the development of full relations, which was finally begun, or they finally arrived at that in 1979, where the US fully recognized China, but at the same time, and also recognized the one China policy, which meant that China was the rightful controller or owner of Taiwan, but also kind of guaranteed Taiwan's independence from China at the same time. So it was kind of a balancing act for the US. But what this period in the 70s did was it kind of reopened the door for relations between the two countries. And then what followed was a gradual increase in economic ties, in political ties, and even in 1984, Washington gave permission to Beijing to begin seeking to buy weapons from the US. But then things began to change. While on one side, the economic ties became closer and closer, on the other, political ties became more complicated. In 1989, there was the Tiananmen Square massacre, which resulted in significant political and economic sanctions on China from much of the Western world. In 1996, as Taiwan sought its first election and it became a full democracy, China threatened with some weapons exercises and missile tests, threatened Taiwan, and the US moved in 2 carrier battle groups into the region to prevent China from taking further aggressive action. But still, despite this, economic ties increased. Then in 1999, during the war in former Yugoslavia, NATO aircraft, particularly US aircraft, bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which resulted in a significant number of apologies to Beijing, which NATO and the US forces argued was just a mere error rather than any kind of conspiracy. And then just prior to 9/11, in April 2001, there was a spy plane standoff where a US ISR aircraft collided with a Chinese fighter aircraft somewhere off the coast of China. This resulted in the death of the Chinese pilot and the US spy plane having to make an emergency landing on Hainan Island, which is a very important strategic Chinese island in the South China Sea. What resulted in there was the US pilot and the crew of the aircraft captured and held captive for 24 days, or as guests of China for 24 days. And finally, George W. Bush had to make a formal apology to China for the loss of life in order to get those 24 men back. And then something significant happened. While China in 2007 increased military spending significantly, and for the first time the US began to publicly state that the increases in spending were not congruent with China's message of economic development and peaceful rise. But in 2008, there was a global financial crisis. And while the US and Europe's economies collapsed, or the kind of traditional economic powers economies collapsed, China's largely thrived. And China's stature as an economic power grew and grew. And through globalization, the Chinese economy, the US economy, and the world's Western economy became ever more interdependent. And by 2010, China had overtaken Japan and become the world's second largest economy. So on the one hand, up until this point, you have had occasionally strained political ties, strained strategic issues, particularly specific flashpoints, but economic ties had generally tended to follow a significant upward trend of cooperation and interdependence, and increasing interdependence. However, the US, if you go back to what we talked about before, does not like one significant dominant power in the region. And in 2011, Hillary Clinton, then the Secretary of State under President Obama, wrote an article arguing that the US needed to repivot to China or to Asia to counter China's rise. And what that looked like, or what the argument for the so-called pivot to Asia in 2011 looked like, was a significant military buildup, increased political engagement in the region, the US retaking the economic initiative in the region through the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was going to be the kind of excluding China, the world's largest free trade agreement, and increased efforts in things like capacity building for maritime security. That was announced in 2011, but many have argued that it kind of failed. In 2014, it was renamed the Rebalance, as some thought the pivot to Asia was too aggressive towards China. But in reality, the military buildup had already begun, but in political terms and economic terms, things had taken a slower turn, and the pivot to Asia has largely been regarded as a failure in Washington. The TPP was perhaps the one success story, and it was due to be signed just after President Trump took office. But as he took office, running on a platform against free trade agreements, he pulled the US out. So now the TPP is in operation without the US, and China is currently developing a counter free trade agreement with the similar nations called RECAP. But just because the pivot under the Obama administration did not really work, it does not mean the US has forgotten about this. 2017, the US Department of Defense released the Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. So the US military in particular has taken a greater lead in affairs in the region, and instead of just looking at the Pacific, they've now renamed the entire area the Indo-Pacific, which is something that many countries in the region have now also taken on, including France, India, Australia, now refer to the Indo-Pacific to include the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Now this is reflected, or this was because of increasing attention to China as a peer competitor with the United States. And what we have seen now, if you talk about briefly, is increased economic competition, and under President Trump, economic decoupling, or trying to reduce US reliance on Chinese parts and the Chinese economy. There has also been a greater military response. The US military has now stated that the most modern equipment will go to Asia first, that the vast majority of US capabilities will be deployed to Asia before other theaters. There's also been an increasing operational tempo in the region. For example, increasing freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, greater engagement with allies, and basically a larger US presence in Asia and more visible US presence in Asia. Alongside that, many have argued that the US has needed to even increase its engagement with regional partners and allies. And part of this engagement is now kind of summed up in the Quad, which is the US, Japan, India, and Australia, plus potentially more in the future, which is kind of a loose alignment of like-minded democracies which publicly seek to enforce the liberal order, who China views as a kind of counterweight or containment effort to prevent China's rise. But there are a number of problems with how the US has approached Asia in recent months and years. The first is the military versus economic response. So the US Department of Defense, and particularly the US Navy, has taken the lead in many efforts in Asia. And this has resulted in problems in connecting the military response to economic initiatives and political initiatives. So many countries in the region are not convinced of the US or the permanency of the US commitment to them across the spectrum of areas where China is also involved. Married to that are global commitments. One of the reasons why the pivot to Asia failed was because the US was distracted by operations in Afghanistan, the Middle East, the Ukraine. So while China can largely focus much of its military might in Asia, the United States remains committed to a large number of theaters, and events often overtake the best laid plans. And this is obviously linked to geography and power. So China, we have to acknowledge, is there in Asia, and Asian states are very well aware of this. And therefore they are more exposed to Chinese power than many in America would like to acknowledge. and they have to deal with China on a daily basis. So it is very difficult for America to convince them to fully go to the US side to maintain US hegemony. And then obviously there's a problem with Trump and the alliances. Trump has looked for the US alliances, particularly Japan and South Korea, to pay a lot more for the US presence in the region, and this is creating a lot of bad will. And equally, the US have a mixed track record in supporting its allies against China. And the picture on the bottom right there, or the bottom left there, of the THAAD missile system, which was deployed to South Korea in 2016. The Chinese were extremely unhappy that the US had deployed this system. They felt it was impacted Chinese strategic stability, but they did not punish the United States. They punished South Korea economically and politically for a sustained period of time. Now, the problem with that was the United States did not support South Korea against China in economic or political terms. Rather, they just argued that the THAAD system was necessary and was defensive. So while the Allies look at the problems China pose in interconnected ways, very often the US response has been one-dimensional and not connected. And this kind of concept feeds into how the regional powers, for example, Malaysia or Vietnam or Indonesia, view the US position in Asia in terms of China's rise. They want the US in the region to counter China, but they do not want a military confrontation between China and the US at the same time. So this middle picture here was taken only a few days ago. That is a US littoral combat ship operating near a Malaysian survey vessel that was being harassed by Chinese vessels, who were illegally surveying near in Malaysian waters, or Malaysian controlled waters. And so the US deployed vessels in the region to show support for Malaysia, but this did not stop China from operating. And this is the difficulty the US faces, which we'll go into in a few weeks' time in greater detail. So this leads us to a large number of future questions. For the United States and Washington, the key question is the US position in Asia stable? Or in other words, can China replace the US as the Asian hegemon? Second question the US has to face is, will allies defect from the US? And so you see in kind of policy writing and academic writing occasional thoughts about South Korea or Japan defecting or leaving the US alliance. But the reality is, in my view, the US, they have no other option. China is not an option to take. Then leading to that is the US response of increased military presence actually increasing the risk of war? What are the escalation dynamics in play? You also need to consider, is a military-led strategy the optimal one? Who should take the lead in determining US grand strategy and how it is operationalized within Asia? Should it be the military, or should it be the State Department, or even the Commerce Department? And this leads to, how does the US persuade regional powers to stand up to China? What measures do the US need to improve their credibility with regional powers to increase their standing in the face of Beijing's coercive acts? And this feeds directly into the problem the US has of exercising its grand strategy of preventing China from becoming the dominant power in the region. And then finally, for us, the big question is, will the US grand strategy in Asia drag in Europe and NATO? Is it in Europe's and NATO's interests to ensure that China is not allowed to rise unchecked? And is the US approach to preventing that from happening the optimal one for policymakers in European capitals and in Brussels? Thank you.